I have been studying Aristotle's Categories and De Interpretatione. When I am studying something seriously, I make notes, draw diagrams, etc. Since I like mucking around in PowerPoint, I've been experimenting with making PowerPoint my note-taking vehicle. Wasting time printing up the slides, I also find therapeutic. For purposes of my future review, I also find it useful to record my notes. These are notes to myself. They could conceivably be useful to someone else, so I've made them public on YouTube, but they are geared strictly for my own needs. For the Greek text, I use Lorenzo Migno Paluello's 1949 Oxford Classical Text Edition. John Lloyd Ackrell's 1963 English translation and notes are indispensable. In these notes, I also refer frequently to Paul Studman's article on Aristotle's Categories in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The Categories starts as follows, with Ackrell's translation. Homonyma legetai hon onoma monon koinon, hode kata tunoma logos tes ousias heteros. When things have only a name in common, and the definition of being which corresponds to the name is different, they are called homonymous. Hoion zdoion ho te anthropos kaito gegramenon. Thus, for example, both a man and a picture are animals. Touton gar onoma monon koinon, hode kata tunoma logos tes ousias heteros. These have only a name in common, and the definition of being which corresponds to the name is different. Angar apodidoitis tiestin auton hekateroi to stoioi enai, idion hekateru logon apodose. For if one is to say what being an animal is for each of them, one will give two distinct definitions. Synonyma de legetai, things are called synonymous, etc. Human beings have given things names. Aristotle begins by distinguishing three classifications of things according to how they are named, homonymously, synonymously, and paronymously. Aristotle applies these terms to things named, not to the names themselves. When we call a man animal, and we call the figure of an animal in a painting animal, in two different senses of the word animal, the man and the figure are homonymous. We may say, like Aristotle, that a holding area for animals and a writing instrument are homonymous because we name both pen, but much more commonly we speak in terms of the name itself being a homonym. On the other hand, we may also call an anthropos and a bous, an ox, animal. Since in this case the definition of animal is the same, anthropos and bous are synonymous. Homonymous and synonymous are coordinate terms. Paronymus is a little different. If a man possesses the quality of bravery, Andrea, we call him Andreos. In other words, Andrea with a different ending or inflection, ptosis in Greek. The brave man, ho Andreos, is paronymus. Paronymy has particular application to the qualification of things. In Chapter 8 on the category of qualifications, Aristotle says the great majority of things are qualified paronymously. For example, repeating his example from the first chapter, ho grammatikos, the man knowing or teaching grammar, from tes grammatikes. However, sometimes the quality from which the qualified thing gets its name does not itself have a name. The runner and the boxer, ho dromikos and ho puktikos, are so called by virtue of certain natural capacities, but these capacities have no names in Greek, so the dromikos and the puktikos are not so called paronymously. By contrast, we have branches of knowledge which we call the knowledge of boxing and the knowledge of wrestling, pyktikē episteme and palaistrikē episteme. Notice that by names, Aristotle doesn't always mean single words, and from these qualities, boxers and wrestlers are called pyktikoi and palaistrikoi paronymously. Finally, in some cases, the quality in question has a name, but the qualified thing is not named from it. For example, a man is qualified as good, hos spudaios, from the quality of virtue, arete, hence not called virtuous paronymously. A few meta-observations about the categories. In Aristotle, kategoria means predication, so the title kategoriae means predications. In imitation of the OCT edition, I have bracketed this title. In his preface, Minio Paluello says, Titulos quibus liber uterque inscribi solet editor quidam Andronico antiquior ad didisse videtur, cum nusquam apud Aristotelem inveniantur. Rodio autem notos fuisse credere liceat. Some editor prior to Andronicus of Rhodes lived in the 1st century BCE, seems to have added the titles usually given to each of these two books, that is, the categories in the De Interpretatione, or Peri Hermeneias in Greek, which titles are never found in Aristotle, but evidently were known to the Rhodian, neque aptos eos esse, neque apteores titulos alios quibus alai antiquitus categorias inscribi voluerunt facile iis patebit qui libros perlegerent. And it will be clear to whoever shall have read these books that neither those titles are apt, nor are the alternative titles others in antiquity chose more apt. The alternative titles from antiquity that Minio Paluello is talking about for the categories we know from the testimony of ancient commentators like Porphyry and Simplicius. The alternative titles reflect alternative conceptions of the subject matter and purpose of the work. Titles such as Categoriae Deca, the 10 categories referring to the number of individual predications that Aristotle identifies, Peri ton genon tu ontos, on the genera of being, and Peri ton deca genon, on the 10 genera, referring to a particular conception of what constitutes the subject matter of the work, and Proton topikon, introduction to the topics, representing the view that the purpose of this work is to serve as an introduction to another work in the organon called topics. The Greek word organon means instrument, tool, organ. Not by Aristotle, but by some unknown person at some unknown time after Aristotle, the individual works of Aristotle related to logic were grouped together and called the organon of logic, that is, the instrument for systematic instruction on the subject of logic. The organon had a prescribed pedagogical sequence, beginning with the categories, dealing with the logical concept of terms, then on interpretation, dealing with logical propositions made from terms, prior and posterior analytics, the classic treatment of syllogisms made from propositions and of scientific demonstration, respectively, and finally the topics and the sophistical refutations, dealing with dialectical arguments and fallacies, respectively. The idea of the organon plays a huge role in the history of philosophy, but to be emphasized, it does not come from Aristotle. The manuscript tradition bundled the works of the organon together, and this tradition culminated in the editio princeps of the organon from the Aldine Press in Venice in 1495. Here you can buy an original edition of its first volume for a mere $75,000. In 1844, the German psychologist, anthropologist, and philologist Theodor Waitz published a critical edition of the Organon. The Waitz edition remained the authoritative edition until the Oxford Classical Text editions of the 20th century. Oxford University Press issued new critical editions of pairs of works from the Organon in separate publications. In the first half of the 19th century, prior to the Waitz edition of the Organon, Augustus Emanuel Becker applied the Becker numbering system to the Royal Prussian Academy's publication of the entire Aristotelian corpus. Becker numbering is still the standard form of citation to the works of Aristotle. Since the Academy's arrangement of the collected works begins with the Organon, the Categories starts with Becker number 1a, line number 1. Migno Paluello reports that most of the ancient manuscripts, translations, and commentaries divide the Categories into 11 parts with corresponding subtitles. 10 of the 11 correspond to the 10 categories Aristotle expounds in this work. Modern editions of the Categories are divided into 15 chapters. I do not know when these chapter numbers were introduced, but I would guess with the Editio Princeps. Chapters 1 through 4 of the Categories take us through some preliminary points up to and including a list of the 10 categories. Chapters 5 through 9 present the core of the work, the doctrine of each of the 10 categories, the bulk of the treatment going to the first 4. The final chapters, 10 through 15, deal with a variety of topics not directly related to the categories. Since the Latin word for category in its Aristotelian meaning of predication is praedicamentum, these 3 divisions have been called the pre-praedicamenta, the praedicamenta, and the post-praedicamenta, respectively. Going all the way back to Andronicus, there has been a suspicion that the post-praedicamenta were added to the work by someone other than Aristotle. To my knowledge, there is no contemporary consensus about that one way or the other. I mentioned Porphyry and Simplicius, 2 of the ancient Greek commentators on the works of Aristotle. Another important commentator was Boethius. Porphyry and Boethius are of special importance. Porphyry was a 4th century CE Neoplatonist and the editor and publisher of the well-known Neoplatonic treatises, the 6 Enneads of Plotinus. Plotinus was Porphyry's teacher. Plotinus was allegedly anti-Aristotelian, or at least heir to a pro-Platonic forms anti-Aristotelian categories tradition. In the first 3 treatises of his 6th Ennead, which are titled Peri ton genon tu ontos, Plotinus systematically refutes the claims Aristotle makes for his 10 categories. Recall that one of the alternative titles to Aristotle's categories was Peri ton genon tu ontos. Porphyry, nevertheless, in an apparent defense of Aristotle, and in an effort to harmonize Plato and Aristotle, wrote both an introduction to Aristotle's categories called the Isagoge and 2 commentaries on the categories, a long one that is lost and a shorter one in question and answer format which survives. Though best known for his own literary work, Philosophiae Consolatio, Boethius is also historically important as the transmitter of Greek logic to the Latin West. This was the result of 2 commentaries he did on Porphyry's Isagoge, plus a commentary on the categories that largely follows Porphyry, and 2 commentaries on the De Interpretatione. Porphyry's commentary on the De Interpretatione is lost. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Boethius's second commentary on the Isagoge, his commentary on the categories, and his second commentary on the De Interpretatione were the main instruments for 9th through 12th century logicians' understanding of Aristotle, up to and including Thomas Aquinas. Besides wanting to understand Aristotle, one of the reasons I am studying the categories and the De Interpretatione is to better understand this branch of the history of philosophy. And because Boethius's Latin supplied medieval and Renaissance philosophy with so much of its critical terminology, my original intention was that wherever I have a Greek passage in these notes, I would also provide Boethius's Latin. For example, here is Boethius's translation of the opening section of the categories. Homonyma, synonyma, and paronyma have been passed down to us as equivoca or equivocal, univoca or univocal, and denominativa translated in the lobe as derivative. However, providing the Latin proved too burdensome, so I am mostly only providing the Greek. The project known as the Commentaria in Aristotelem Graeca, or CAG, has published the original Greek texts of the substantial body of ancient Greek commentaries on various works of Aristotle. The Latin texts of Boethius's commentaries on Porphyry and Aristotle are available in the various 19th century collections and their online versions shown on this slide. In addition, the good news is that Porphyry's Isagoge is available in English in an excellent edition from Clarendon and Jonathan Barnes, and the ancient Greek commentaries as well as Boethius's commentaries on the De Interpretatione in superb editions from Bloomsbury. The outstanding Desideratum is a good edition and translation of Boethius's commentary on the categories. One is supposed to be forthcoming from the Norwegian scholar Monica Astolos, but as of the writing of these notes, it has been indefinitely delayed. In the eyes of modern editors, the title Categories does not come from Aristotle, and in Minio Paluello's view is not even apt. Which begs two questions. What are quote-unquote categories, and what is this work traditionally called Categories all about? There are three ways we can seek answers to these questions. One, of course, is to figure it out for ourselves by reading it carefully, which is primarily what I'm trying to do. A second is to consult the ancient commentators. A third, to consult modern scholarship. Let us try the second and see what Porphyry has to say. His commentary is in question and answer format. The commentary begins with some questions from his pupil about the title of the work. Porphyry explains why Categoriae is the correct and appropriate name. In this context, I will strip the brackets from around Categoriae. As those of us who have studied Greek know, Categoria is typically the name of the prosecutor's speech in a trial, apologia, that of the defendant. But for their purposes, Porphyry explains, philosophers needed to invent or repurpose common expressions. With a modified version of Stephen Strange's translation from the Bloomsbury edition, to un tes categorias onoma kemenon ente sun etheae epidikaiologias elenctices tes dialogon menuseos labon, adopting the word categoria that is applied in ordinary usage to the speech of the prosecution, autos tas ton lexeon ton semantikon kata ton pragmaton agorelses categorias pros epen. He called those utterances in which significant expressions are applied to things categoriae. Hoste passa haple lexis semanticae hotan kata tu semino menu pragmatos agorelthe te kai lecthe legetai categoria. Hence, whenever a simple significant expression is employed and said of what it signifies, this is called a categoria. This is what Latin speakers called a praedicamentum, and what we therefore call a predication. With phrases like simple, significant, significant expression, and simple significant expression, Porphyry is drawing on the terminology and concepts of the De Interpretatione. His framework is that of the organon, the domain of logic. If I point to a stone and say, "This is a stone," he says, the simple significant expression stone is a categoria. That is what a categoria is, according to Porphyry. More specifically, Porphyry has just said categoriae are simple significant expressions about things, kata ton pragmaton. But Porphyry is clear the work is about the expressions, lexes or ponai, and not about the things the expressions signify. In fact, that is the reason he rejects the alternative titles periton genon tu ontos and periton decagenon, because that would make the work about beings, about the things in the universe, and not about the expressions we use to signify them. Hoti tamen onta kai ta tuton gene kai ta ere kai hai diaporai pragmata asti kai uponai. Because beings and their genera and species and differentiae are things, not words. But to explain this in full, he would first have to indicate what the purpose, the prothesis, of the work is. "Oh, please do," implores the student. Okay, at some point man set about indicating and signifying the things around him with words, that is, specific sounds. He indicated or signified gold with the sound kruson, this thing chair with the sound bathron, etc. This Porphyry calls man's first imposition or prothesis of words. Then man began to reflect upon these expressions and saw that some are of a type we call nouns, onomata, and some of a type we call verbs, remata. With this distinction, Porphyry is again drawing on the terminology and the concepts of the De Interpretatione. This Porphyry calls man's second imposition of words, or deutera thesis. The subject of the categories is the first imposition, simple significant words or expressions insofar as they signify things. And of course, in this view, the De Interpretatione will be about the second imposition. The categories is not, however, about simple significant expressions as they differ in number. If the treatise were dealing with categoriae like stone, it would be practically infinite in length. It is about how they differ in genus. Hence, as we will see, it is specifically about the 10 genera of simple significant expressions that Aristotle comes up with. Concluding this line of thought, Porphyry tells his student, "Hoten epe peri ponon semantikon hyprothesis katho semainusi ton katagenos diaporon onton." So, since the subject of the book is significant expressions differing in genus insofar as they signify, Toda agoreuen ta pragmata kata ti semainomenon categorein elegon, kai holos to lexin semantikein kata pragmaton legen, and people used to call speaking of things according to a certain signification, and in general the utterance of a significant expression about something as categorein, ekotos categorias epigrapsen, ten periton haplon lexeon stoikeosin, ten katho semantikai ton pragmaton esin pro egumenos katagenos hekaston theorumenin. It was quite reasonable for him to give the title categoriae to this elementary discussion of simple expressions, which considers them according to genus insofar as they primarily signify things. The fundamental disagreement among Aristotle's commentators, Stephen Strange says, was over whether the Categories was a logical work concerning either simple terms or the simple concepts they represent, or a work of metaphysics concerned with the classification of simple entities or concepts by genera. For Porphyry and for Boethius following him, it was a work of logic. We said the third way to get an answer to the question, what is the categories all about, is to consult modern scholarship. So I will close this excursus with the following remark from Acrel. From Aristotle's distinction between homonymous and synonymous, one could evidently derive a distinction between equivocal and unequivocal names. But it is important to recognize from the start that the categories is not primarily or explicitly about names, but about the things that names signify. Aristotle relies greatly on linguistic facts and tests, but his aim is to discover truths about non-linguistic items. In other words, in this view, it is primarily about ta pragmata.